College football nerds here talking Texas A&M and Georgia. I want to remind y'all, some of y'all have kind of, we hadn't talked much. A&M, I think we haven't done a whole lot on y'all lately. Georgia fans, A&M fans, or anybody else watching, we do have an audio version of this show. We try to get it out same day. Sometimes it might take a day or so to get the audio version out, but it is on your favorite podcasting platform, iTunes and Android. We need to get on Spotify too. And you can also get a direct link from our website, College Football Nerds, for each of the episodes we make. All right, Josh. I had Utah over Georgia this week in my top 10. You did not. I imagine that upset a few Georgia fans. My reasoning was, look, we were all over the Auburn game. I said 21-17. We both flagged the struggles that each would have and the strengths and weaknesses of each team. We were all over the game. Model said 20-20, all over it. Georgia needed every bit of that jumping out in front of Auburn to win that game. I don't think there's any shame in that. I think Auburn's a good football team, and it's interesting to me. So I want to take a step back, and maybe we're in friendly SEC circles here so we can talk about this. But a lot of people are downplaying some wins against an Auburn, against a Florida, maybe against Texas A&M. And I want to start this off by putting into perspective what these teams are that Georgia's playing, because Auburn's losses are to Florida and Georgia and LSU. Texas A&M's got losses to Alabama, to Clemson, maybe to Georgia, maybe to LSU. Before we get started about breaking this game down, is it fair to say that the teams that Georgia's beating that are in that 15-25 range would be top 10 teams if they were in the ACC or got, Big Ten East or Pac-12?
I think so. And this is really true for both teams, right? The problem in college football year in and year out is that people tend to look at win-loss records and ignore everything else. And I don't think this year is any different in that regard. There's certainly some teams that are at the top of the rankings that shouldn't be. And I'll throw out some stats here, okay? So this is something I dug up on Cincinnati and Cincinnati compared to Texas A&M here in a second, all right? So Cincinnati sitting in the AP poll at number 17 in the country. They're 9-1. Cincinnati has one win over a top 50 team. That's number 18 UCF. They have UCF themselves only has one win over a top 50 team, and that was number 46 Temple. Cincinnati does not have a 14-point win or greater over a top 75 team, meaning every time Cincinnati's played anyone in the top 75, they've either lost or won close. And Cincinnati has been within 2 touchdowns, aka a close game, with number 107 East Carolina, number 92 Tulsa, number 91 South Florida. That's SP+. So the point is, when you look at stuff, Cincinnati and a lot of Ohio State fans like to gloat. Yeah, they played this great Cincinnati. They're number 17. But to be honest, give me a break. I don't know any reason why a lot of teams wouldn't be ranked if they had that record. And a lot of SEC teams would be ranked just as high. Now, the really good SEC teams are already at the top. And a lot of people outside the SEC are already sort of griping about the fact that you have LSU number 1 and Georgia number 4. Alabama's number 5. Florida's number 10, Auburn's number 16, on down the list. That's a lot of SEC teams at the top of the rankings. I think what they miss, though, is teams like South Carolina, teams like Missouri, and how they might fall. Now, Missouri's probably a special case because they've managed to lose to nobodies. But some of these other teams, particularly
But they also killed West Virginia.
Right, yeah. I mean, they did kill West Virginia, and West Virginia turns around and beats that Kansas State team that was supposed to be such a tough opponent. And, of course, there's this circular thing where Oklahoma fans say, oh, Kansas State, but they were a top 25 team. It's not a bad loss. We had pointed out the fact that South Carolina in SP Plus at the time, I think they were like 38th, and Kansas State was like 34th or 36th. They were within 5 spots of each other in the 30s. It really wasn't any different other than the perception because the win-loss record Kansas State had and the fact that South Carolina may actually have the just straight up hardest schedule in college football history. Not an exaggeration. People say generational player. Nope. It's an incredibly, ridiculously difficult schedule. Sort of flip it around. So I gave those stats with Cincinnati, right? No win. They didn't have any 14 plus or greater win over a top 75 team. No dominant wins over a team with anything resembling a pulse of the entire season. One top 50 win, and that was over a team that themselves only had one top 50 win. Now you look at a team like Texas A&M. Now it's easy for people to say Texas A&M, well, they lost 3 games. They weren't always competitive in those games, but you look at their record in terms of what they were able to accomplish. They've got a top 50 win over South Carolina, who's number 41 in SP+. They've got South Carolina themselves has 2 top 50 wins, Kentucky and, of course, Georgia. Texas A&M has 14 plus or greater wins over 2 top 75 teams in South Carolina and Mississippi State. And Texas A&M has only had 1 close game over a team not in the top 75. That was the early game against an Arkansas team that's cared. The point of that long discussion is the SEC kind of gets a bad rap because only so many teams can have 1 or 2 losses in a given season. And it can inflate you and it can deflate you. There have been times the SEC's been overrated because the conference wasn't overly good internally. This year, the out-of-conference schedule suggests that's not the case. And I think, as we said in our top 10 video, it's more likely that the Big Ten right now probably, they've got a lot of teams that, Iowa and Michigan, in Wisconsin and Penn State and Minnesota, they're on a conference slates, 17-10 win over Pitt with Penn State. It's a close win over Iowa State that really shouldn't have happened, but it was a muff punt at the end of the game for Iowa. Wisconsin beat South Florida. That's not a big deal. We know that now. Michigan has that 1 win over Notre Dame and then some really nasty out-of-conference games early. We kind of brush it aside because they've looked good in conference, but that's because they're playing each other. So long-winded discussion, but it's important in framing both these teams, particularly Texas A&M, which is why it's worthwhile. Texas A&M, in my view, really ought to be ranked right now with 3 losses. I mean, they are 24th, but when you compare them like Cincinnati up there at 17, I don't see any reason why A&M wouldn't have the same record that Cincinnati would have if they had the same schedule. Yeah, they lose to A&M. They probably have fewer close games compared to Cincinnati. It's not a big deal to beat UCLA. It's certainly not a big deal to beat UCLA 24-14. And Georgia's kind of been a victim of that, where people overlook a lot of their schedule and say, it's not that hard. And yeah, some of the shines come off Notre Dame, but you know what? Tennessee's a top 40 team. South Carolina is like 41, as I said. Kentucky's a top 50 team. Florida's a top 15 team. Missouri's a top 40 team. And a lot of these teams you compare them to, they've played 1, 2, or 3 top 40 teams total and struggled in a couple of them. You just can't say that about Georgia, and you can't say that Texas A&M wouldn't have a similar record as those teams if they played, not a half dozen teams in the top 20.
It's interesting because last year Texas A&M the same thing happened. They played Clemson out of conference, which everyone who played Clemson out of conference last year would have had a loss. Texas A&M takes that loss. They lose to Alabama. They lose to Mississippi State, who had the best defense in the country. And, they roll into the bowl game as like the number 7 SEC team, play ACC number 2, beat them 52-13. And I'm not saying that's going to happen this year. I'm not saying that Texas A&M is overrated or underrated, but what I am saying is if you give Texas A&M Cincinnati's schedule, they have Cincinnati's record. If you give Cincinnati Texas A&M's schedule, they have probably worse than Texas A&M's record. So one of the things I want to talk about real fast, and we kind of want to make this one a quick one. Texas A&M, we came into the season really worried about their defense because they lost a lot of people, and we're high on their offense. But is it fair to say this deep into the season, what we've seen, the empirical data shows that Texas A&M might have a really good defense and is really underperforming on offense?
I think it's hard to say how good that defense is relative to expectations and relative to what they were last year. So last year, we talked about it a lot. Their rush defense would be like 60%, which is a great average of opponent averages that we talk about a lot. The pass defense was like 120%. It was very poor. Do you mind if I get in the model real quick to just go ahead and start pulling up those numbers? So we run percentage of opponent averages allowed in our model. That's not a normal stat you see elsewhere. It's a simple one. If your opponents average 6 yards per carry and you give up 8, then you're pretty terrible. If they average 8 yards per carry and you give up 6, you're averaging 75% of their averages. A&M allows 90% of opponent rush averages and 85% of their opponent passing averages. Georgia allows 71% and 74%. Georgia definitely has a better defense than Texas A&M. But Texas A&M does have a good defense. And it's a little tough with A&M because their opponents have been at times really good and at times really bad. And I think the biggest thing I can say for them is in the games where they've played teams that are really, really good offensively, like Clemson, like Alabama, they've held their own. I mean, 5.7 yards per play is not bad against Clemson. 6.9 sounds bad against Alabama, but Alabama is a freight train. They held Auburn under 5 yards per play. They held South Carolina under 5 yards per play. Struggled a little bit with Ole Miss and had a kind of a bad game against Mississippi State, but that's more of a different story. But generally, they've been really good, or at least solid. Now, again, Georgia's elite, but I think the biggest thing is last year, A&M, their pass defense was just atrocious. And, week in and week out, they were giving up awful numbers. 8.2 yards per attempt on the season. They allowed over 10 yards per attempt to 4 different teams in 2018. They haven't allowed 10 yards per attempt this year. And even Alabama, who's the big passing offense they faced, when they were clicking, Alabama averages over 10 yards per attempt with Tua, and they held them to 8.6. I mean, that sounds like a high number, but it's, again, not bad. And last 4 weeks, they've been between 4.5 and 6.5 yards per attempt. That's awesome. So I do think they're a very underrated defense. I think the run defense has taken, there was a little bit that maybe the run defense took a step back and the pass defense took 2 steps forward. But the net result is a lot better because last year you could exploit them, and this year I don't think you can.
In that Mississippi State game, I will say they were killing Mississippi State, and the backups gave up some points late. So we talk about this and I wanted to frame that a little bit because Georgia fans may not know that, in the past or in the very recent past, Texas A&M has been known to put up a decent number offensively and has been known to be pretty terrible defensively. I don't think it's the case this year, and I think it walks like a duck, talks like a duck. At some point, we got to give them their due on both sides of the ball. One of my concerns is we've noted this. We flagged this in the Clemson game, and we felt it coming into the season. It's shown up this year as well. Jimbo Fisher's offense, I think, is overly complicated, requires a very specific type of quarterback, and he doesn't give his quarterbacks the opportunity to he doesn't give them easy throws to get them in a rhythm. You see all these crazy highlight reel throws that Mond makes, but it's usually that one throw that he completes, and it's surrounded by 7 or 8 what was he thinking plays because he's having to overthink. For all of the criticism of Georgia's offense, their defense has really just not let them down one time this year. And I have some worry coming into this game for that very reason. They've got a good running game with Spiller, not great. I have some concerns if I'm a Texas A&M fan coming into this game that the Georgia's defense is legit, and what we've seen with Texas A&M is a little shaky from these elite defenses. And I think they're going to have to score at least 24 points to win this game, which might lead you more into the model. But is that kind of where this game starts and ends?
I think probably so. So here's a last stat I'll get into before we really get in the score prediction with the model. If you look at the opponent averages of these two teams face, and that's one of the numbers we kind of generate and then plug into other stuff we do on our model, it's pretty clear that A&M has faced different competition than Georgia. A&M's opponents average 4.7 yards per carry, 7.1 yards per attempt. Georgia's opponents average about 4.1 yards per carry and 6.9 yards per attempt. And I think the thing that really sticks out with A&M, one, the passing offenses haven't necessarily been that great, right? So, 7 yards per attempt for them. But the same issue again with Georgia, even lower at 6.9. Basically, what Georgia has faced on average is Texas A&M. 6.9 yards per attempt is about where A&M is, more closer to 7. You're looking at like a Kent State, Western Kentucky, Texas A&M, Missouri on average. A&M not all that different, but in the run game in particular, I think it's a pretty interesting story because A&M's average opponent is about Utah or Auburn, which is 42nd in the country. Georgia's opponent, it's 0.6 of a yard less, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but it's a huge deal in the ratings. It's about 40 slots slower. So it's like A&M's faced Utah every week in the run offense, and Georgia's been facing Coastal Carolina. Troy, Michigan are the teams bracketing them, just to give some context. So I think it goes to A&M's advantage that Georgia hasn't faced elite teams. that can really move the ball offensively on both sides of the ball. The one team that was pretty good, I would say, would be Florida. Even Notre Dame is not a good offensive team this year. There's opportunities there for A&M to maybe show in a way that Georgia couldn't, show things that maybe expose Georgia in a way that we haven't seen before. Because we see this a lot. We've seen it with Michigan for years. If you don't face teams over a certain competency level and you're a really good defense, you can kind of shut people down. The problem is, A&M has given yards against the pass to teams similar to Georgia. Georgia's been a lot more effective in passing defense. But A&M, I would argue, has actually faced teams that can throw the ball. And when you look at teams like Clemson and Alabama and the fact that they've held those low, we haven't seen Georgia be challenged in that context. So I think it does kind of begin and end with Georgia's defense. The question is, how much is Georgia's defense really, top 5 elite, and how much of it is kind of a product of the competition? I tend to think you always have to combine the two, and that tends to put Georgia as a top 5 overall unit. But I think there's opportunities there for maybe A&M to score. And I will say, flipping to the model before I hand it back to you, that's what the model sees. It sees A&M at about 4.3 yards per play. It sees Georgia at about 5.3 yards per play. Neither one of those numbers are great. A&M and Georgia are both expected to pass like 5 to 6 yards per attempt. Really awful numbers in this game. But A&M is expected to run for only about 3.5 yards per carry, and Georgia about 4.8. So neither team is expected to get a lot of production. But A&M is expected to move in enough to score some, 16 points for A&M. But Georgia's also not really expected to score a lot either with 23. So it has Georgia 23, A&M 16 in a low offensive output game where A&M maybe scores a little more than Auburn does or moves it a little better. Georgia is able to score maybe a little more than they were in the last game. But it's pretty tight. It's a 1-touchdown game in the low 20s. And as I often say, if you're below 24 points and you're within a touchdown, anything can happen because it's so variable and so dependent on something going wrong.
All right, I want to talk about Georgia a little bit, and then we can give our scores, because I think we've spent a lot of time on A&M, and I do want to give Georgia their due. So for me, I feel like we've been waiting for Georgia, waiting offensively. Defensively, I do think that there is a little bit to the fact that they haven't played a lot of good offenses, but I also think this defense is just really good. So I wonder, is there, and I don't know where your score is going, where your head's at on score, and maybe you can take my question and lead into your score prediction, but to me, I just feel like at some point, and this is partly why I had Utah ahead of Georgia, because I'm giving myself room, and we've shown that we will shuffle week to week, even this late in the season. I want to see Georgia just wallop somebody. I want to see them just drill somebody that's good. And that's what they haven't done yet. If you want to say, and this is why I think my criticism of Georgia was fair. If you want to say you're a playoff team, then you need to beat Auburn by more than a score. I do think Auburn's better than a lot of, than what their ranking's going to ultimately end up at if they lose to Alabama. But you need to beat somebody of some significance. So, for example, Alabama they were up like 47-20 on Texas A&M. So, and I don't think Alabama's going to make the playoffs. So, Georgia, if you want to be in that conversation, I want to see you beat A&M like that. I don't want to see you beat them 24-17. I want to see you drill them to the wall to show everybody that you can run with an Ohio State or an LSU. And we're going to see LSU in a couple of weeks. Something in my mind thinks that there's too much talent on this team offensively. I've been super high on Jake Fromm since he was a freshman. I think he's way better than he's showing this year. Do you have a feeling that this might be the game, now that playoffs are kind of maybe in reach for Georgia, that this might be the game where they potentially just kind of say, all right, we're done with this. We're going to go out there and just play Georgia football and put up a number. The matchups are somewhat favorable. Is that a possibility for this game? Because I think they kind of need it.
It's a possibility. And, our model has it 7 points. The line is 13, looking at it right now. And I think a lot of what that is about is sort of the split question of, is Georgia going to wake up and finally play offense and defense the way they're supposed to, or are they going to kind of keep eking out these wins? Now, there are a lot of variables in play. Missouri's not a bad team. On average, they've just had massive inconsistency, so 27-0 is nothing to necessarily fret about. Kentucky's in a monsoon, but when you look back the last several games, as you said, the problem in our view is you've played teams like South Carolina and Kentucky and Missouri that are teams that if you're really a top 5 team, I want to see you beating these teams almost easily, right? I mean, the teams that we're comparing Georgia against at that level are LSU and they're Alabama. And Alabama had no issue disposing of South Carolina. Well, let's be blunt. LSU sort of had trouble with Florida, but they didn't really have any trouble moving the ball down the field. I mean, I think they had like 12 yards per play in that game against Florida. Now, Florida scored a lot more on LSU, and that's sort of a different question in Georgia's defense. But I think the issue with Georgia is they're an elite defense and an offense that, for whatever reason, keeps being given the ball over and over in 3 and outs, and they just can't exploit it, and they need to show that. So that's where I think the 13-point line is coming from. It's really, if they stuff A&M the way Clemson, for example, stuffed A&M early in the season, is it going to end up like 24-10 the way Clemson A&M did, or would they actually be able to put up some numbers? Now, that is a big assumption that it goes that way. I mean, do you actually think Georgia has that much of an edge? I mean, where's your score prediction and your head at in this game?
I don't. So here's the thing. I'm kind of conflicted because I do think A&M is a Jekyll and Hyde team too. 24-17 over Ole Miss is not that bad. We saw what Ole Miss did offensively against LSU this past weekend. To the point that you made and that I kind of made as well. Ohio State beat Wisconsin 38-7. They're going to beat Penn State by 17 points this weekend. I want Georgia to do that too, to put them in that discussion. Here's the thing. 13's a lot to put on a team that just played Auburn. I'm going to say they cover that 33-20 or push 33-20. And I think that's a good number given what they just went through in terms of schedule, just coming off that win against Auburn. They couldn't prepare for Texas A&M a week ahead of time. I think that needs to be considered. My score is 33-20. And if they do that, if they beat Texas A&M 33-20, if they push or cover, I'm going to move them back up into 4th. If they struggle with A&M when you've got Alabama drilling them, Clemson drilling them, even Auburn going on the road and being up pretty big on them until the very last minute and A&M put on a late touchdown, I want to see them put up a number, but I don't think they have to beat them by 30 for me to be like, that's a good win.
And I understand that. I just don't think it's going to be that high scoring. I mean, my thing with Georgia, they haven't put up 30 points in a ball game in 6 weeks, since the first week of October against Tennessee, when Tennessee was playing really, really bad football. And they had one good passing game, oddly enough, against Florida, which still, there's a lot of signs to me that Florida has issues, but that's a different discussion for a different day. I want to see Georgia actually put up 30 points in a ball game. And you know me, I'm kind of a show me before I believe you kind of person. When it comes to looking at football teams, I don't necessarily buy into quick changes. And Georgia has consistently had outputs in the 20s. I have this game 20-17, Georgia. I have it very close. I have Georgia winning. And I think Georgia fans have taken a lot of stuff we've said over the course of the season negative. And I really want to make this point. We still have Georgia a top 5 team. The problem is Georgia fans, I think, the Georgia fans, a lot of them have been insulted that we have them right around number 5, or number 4 floating around with Utah. Look, I mean, you're being compared to Clemson and Ohio State and LSU, and then you're floating around Alabama and passing Alabama in our rankings ahead of Oklahoma. I mean, you've got to understand who you're being compared against because, yeah, you beat Florida and you beat Auburn. Florida and Auburn are not going to beat the teams that you're being compared against. And you beat them by 1 touchdown. You need to show that you can beat a Florida and an Auburn by 2 or 3 scores. You need to show that you can beat an A&M by 3 scores or 4 scores because that's what Alabama did. That's Clemson had that game 24-3 in the last minute. And if you want to show that you deserve to be in the playoff, you need to play at that level because you can't keep having these games where you put up 20 points because you're going to play a team with a real quarterback and a real offense, and real offenses will score 30 points on anyone. They will get theirs. and you can hold them to 30 instead of 50 like their normal average. But right now, Georgia hasn't shown me that they can score 30 points on a solid defense. Not a good one, a solid one. Yeah, it's critical, but it's critical to the extent that we're talking about Georgia being number 3, 4, 5, or 6. They're an extremely good team. They are better than Florida. They're better than Auburn. Those are teams we have in their top 10. We think there's separation there. But if you're going to gripe about being Auburn number 5 or Georgia number 5, you need to justify to me why you think they would consistently beat a team like Oklahoma, who we still have behind them, much less a team like, how they would play against a team like LSU, Clemson, or Ohio State. And that's my real evaluation for them going into the A&M game, and they need to prove me wrong.
Yeah, and just to put a final bow on it, because you're being compared to Ohio State. And we'll see the LSU situation play out on the field, so that's not a big deal. Like I'm not worried about comparing you to LSU and their defensive issues. If you play close to LSU, that may be all I need to think you're probably playoff worthy, but don't make the playoffs because of the South Carolina game. To put this into perspective, Ohio State has only scored in the 30s twice this year. Every other game has been 42 points or more, including multiple 70s. And they haven't played the schedule Georgia has. I'm not saying that. But they've scored in the 30s twice. That was a 38-7 win versus Wisconsin and a 34-10 win versus Michigan State. They're going to score in the 30s against Penn State. They're going to score in the 30s against Michigan.
And I'll be clear, I don't think Michigan State or Wisconsin's defense is the be-all, end-all. But to your point,
no,
I don't think South Carolina or Missouri's is either.
Right. So that I don't think it's fair, the criticism we're taking from Georgia fans, when you lost to South Carolina, a team that Alabama killed, when you were ugly against Kentucky in a monsoon, when you're not killing these teams that are 15th best type teams in the country. You need to kill them. And I think Georgia can. That's what's frustrating. Georgia fans are mad at me, but on Saturdays, Georgia fans are just as frustrated as I am watching a team that's underperforming relative to the talent that's on that roster. They've got more talent than everybody they played this year, bar none. They need to go out there and show it by knocking somebody's genitals in the dirt. And I think maybe they'll do it Saturday. We'll see. That's it for us, y'all. Thanks so much for hanging out this long. Have a great week. God bless.